celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the sixth and final week of the six-part series that is entitled The Great Mysteries of Our Time. On the first 5 programs, we brought to you the keynote speaker each day at the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum, and then they appeared on this program. After doing that, we have invited 4 people to the program today that served that week on the panels that discuss these different issues throughout that series. I'm very pleased to welcome, first of all, to the program, to my immediate left, Jeannie Gibbons, who served on the panel on Monday when Mr. Loren Coleman was here. And Jeannie Gibbons is a former member of the Idaho legislature. Welcome, Jeannie.
Thank you, Tony.
Next to her is Charlie Glock, who was a professor of sociology at the University of California at Berkeley. And he was on our panel on the 5th day when Mr. James Randi was here, that was debunking a lot of the issues or questions about the mysteries of our time. Next to him is Joan McEvers, who served on the panel on Thursday when Dr. Raymond Moody was on our program and dealing with near-death experiences. And finally, from North Idaho College's faculty in the Department of Anthropology, Richard Snyder, who was on 2 panels, and he's here and can discuss those 2 days on the Tuesday program of UFOs and on Wednesday the issue of Bigfoot. With that brief background, I would like to not only welcome all of you, but thank you for coming and let us do some of a critique or review of this series that we've been doing called The Great Mysteries of Our Time. Jeannie, if I may start with you, would you give your view and summary of the kinds of things that Loren Coleman was discussing about mysterious places and events that he had observed around the United States and had written in a book on that subject?
Well, Tony, Dr. Coleman pretty well set the tone of what the next 5 days would be. And he did that in a very good way. He backed up his findings with all the research that he has done. He has interviewed hundreds of people, and with these strange and unusual experiences, he educated the audience and told us that we need to remember that these are human beings who personally believe that these things have happened to them. And he touched on UFO sightings, on cattle mutilations, all kinds of very unusual and interesting things. But he also cautioned the audience that we need to approach this entire subject with an open mind and a sense of humor. He was very good.
Well, we also impressed that he indicated that an awful lot of the stories that have been told in folklore over the years that as far as from a scientific view, of course, that it could not be verified. But even though he said there was many things he didn't believe, he discussed why that is in a society and even the importance of people having the opportunity to express that. How would you react to that statement?
He touched on something that I think we all realize after experiencing this week, that there are many people who believe. There are people who have a need to believe these kinds of things. And I accept that, and I have a broader understanding of that just because of Dr. Coleman, so he was very interesting.
Yes. There was a historical perspective to his presentation, wasn't there? Because during the presentation for the audience here at the campus, and he was on this program, he identified a lot of places around the United States, where lakes, where there were stories about lakes, or highways around the country and so forth. So for anyone who's going to be a tourist and just has this curiosity or interest, even from maybe more light approach, it was kind of like a travelogue in a way, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Well, his subject was Mysterious America, so he was able to point all over the map of interesting places to visit if you happen to be in the area. So it was very good.
One of the comments in our dialogue with one another, I think one thing that was very interesting about Mr. Coleman too, and you might want to react to that, is that he indicated that in dealing with all issues in life, including this subject, that a sense of humor was very important.
Yes, yes. He made an unusual observation that many of the people who were experiencing these kinds of things happened to live in mobile homes, and he couldn't account as to whether there was a certain magnetic field in the middle or whatever. But it drew a big chuckle from our audience.
Richard Snyder, if we could take you to Tuesday, and again, of course, that would have been a week later on this program, when the speaker was Aluda Francesca, who was born in London, England, and had a background in music and poetry before she got interested in, among other things, UFOs. Give us your critique in reaction to some of the things that she said.
Well, I think on Monday, Coleman talked about the animals that you mentioned and said where they came from he wasn't sure. He was simply describing what was there. Our speaker on Tuesday, I think, had a pretty good handle on where some of these things came from, at least in terms of her own mind. She said that, yes, in fact, there are UFOs, and yes, in fact, they are manned, or if that's an appropriate term, I don't know, peopled or what, crittered, something, with beings from outside the influence of the Earth. And that they kind of came in three varieties. There were some Nordic types, which seemed to be reasonably sympathetic with human beings. There were Greys, which had no sense of morality and were not sympathetic with the human condition, and also implied a third group that could be made up of Lauren Coleman mentioned Kelly's Little Men. Well, they would be good examples of this third group, possibly black leopards, kangaroos, and so forth and so on, all arriving here via flying saucers, or for lack of a better term. It was interesting that she went to a town in southern London, southern England, and mentioned that aliens broke into the airways of a radio station for a 5.5-minute message to the people of the Earth. And that, of course, this message was covered up by the press in that, have any of you ever heard about it? No, that's because of the cover-up. And Randy, on Friday of the week, mentioned the same message and said that in England they heard about this kind of a message taking place in Philadelphia. And in both cases, all of the evidence relating to such a message have seemed to have disappeared, which is convenient.
But Randy made a very, very important point that in this country, and of course in other countries too, there are laws and records that the FCC requires you to keep everything. And so is there the problem of credibility when you start dealing with things that records are in place, but in other words, since those records have to be kept, you can go back and check any period of time, and it's not found. So I guess what I'm really trying to ask in relation to UFOs, there are people who have been very prominent in American politics and things that have said they've seen simply what is called an unidentified flying object. But when you take it to the point of saying that they've interrupted programs and they're sending messages, or that people are abducted and so forth, that's in a totally different realm, and the skepticism, as James Randi indicated, would really increase.
Oh yes, please don't.
Yes. You're
get the
summarizing
idea
what she
that
said.
I'm in favor of all of this. I'm simply reporting what Francesca said.
Right.
She went on and spent a great deal of time showing us a multi-layered universe in which there were 7 levels, and that a creature or whatever, a living thing on one level cannot perceive anything on any of the other levels, and all of this is going on at the same time. I think I would have liked to have heard more evidence for the existence of UFOs and a little less of the spiritual realm thing. Maybe I'm just not ready for that yet. I'm still dealing with, are these things real, on a kind of very elementary level. I was graced by the opportunity to sit in front of a woman who explained to me about her sighting of a UFO which came over her backyard in Dallas, Texas, and her mother and her sister were there, and she seemed like an extremely sincere person who had been very moved by some event. I'm not trying to poo-poo now. I'm just saying there were people in the audience who found all of this extremely interesting because of events in their lives.
On the third day of the symposium, and also the third week of this program, we dealt with the subject UFOs, and I know, Richard, that you were very involved in bringing John Willison Green from Canada, a journalist for over 30 years, and has written at least 3 books, I believe, on UFOs. So again, let's summarize what you thought about his presentation and how the audience and others reacted to this issue.
John Green was very low-key. A tall, lanky man, 6'3", I think, and he sort of swooped over the audience and eased out a message about a large, hairy primate of some sort occupying the woods of the Pacific Northwest and on into British Columbia, and this animal ranging from 7 or 8 feet tall up to as much as 10, and I've heard of reports of 12 feet tall, which is certainly out of the ordinary. In presenting the evidence for Bigfoot, he admitted it's indirect evidence, that it consists primarily of footprints, some of which show evidence of dermal ridges. Fingerprints are dermal ridges, and if the audience will take a moment right now and check their feet, they'll find out that there are dermal ridges down there too. And if you step in fine soil, evidence of those ridges will be left in the soil. Therefore, you pour plaster of Paris in there, and you can capture those. And some of these have, in fact, shown dermal ridges, including sweat glands, which is kind of powerful stuff. But I like what Randy said on Friday of the week when he said anything like this, whether it's UFOs or a unicorn in his backyard or a Bigfoot in our backyard, this is an extraordinary claim and requires extraordinary evidence.
This is one of the things that Mr. Green and others, I know Dr. Krantz that's been on this program, had indicated that too. One of the very frustrating things for those who take this position is what you're saying, that extraordinary evidence of finding some bones or analyzing hair or actually a particular animal, if it exists, having some of the real physical evidence. And how do you respond as someone who has studied this too, that so many animals that have been found throughout history, and that there's pretty much limiting this to the footprints?
It's shaky. Green maintains that there are so many sightings. He personally has a record of 2,000 of these. Not that he saw Bigfoot 2,000 times, but having talked to other people. And they go back in time. Even David Thompson, the famous explorer of this area for the Hudson's Bay Company, in 1809 was up near Jasper in Alberta, Canada, and reports in his diary encountering these huge footprints, asking the Indians, who told him, yes, big smelly bad guy, don't go that way, and moved him off in another direction. This is an awfully long time for some guy with plywood feet to be walking around the Pacific Northwest. And so Green says, at least holds the opinion, that the easiest explanation for the existence of all of this indirect evidence is that there is an animal there. Now, he doesn't say there is one, but it's the easiest explanation as far as he's concerned.
In other words, there have been enough sightings of footprints that it's hard to take the theory or thesis that one person went around.
Plus, he also brought up the 1967 Patterson film from Northern California, in which something that appears to be at least 7 feet tall, very, very hairy, taking an enormous stride, walks up a wash, Patterson was on horseback at the time, had an 8mm camera. The horse reared up, threw him down into the sand of the wash. He came up, whipped the camera around, and ran off as much footage as he could. The problem is it's a photograph, it's a movie, and these things can be faked. It doesn't mean it is a fake, but the possibility exists, and we're looking for extraordinary evidence. One of the questions that repeatedly was asked of Green, why don't we find bones? And another man said, well, how many people have been in the woods and seen bones? And a lot of the audience raised their hand. And he said, what kind were they? And all the hands went down. There are bones, and nobody knows whether they belong to Bigfoot or not. But Green's position is he can't explain why there isn't a carcass. He says that is truly mysterious.
That's why the word mystery.
Yes.
Joan McEvers, again, welcome to you. And I know that you were here Thursday and you heard Dr. Raymond A. Moody Jr., who's a medical doctor and a PhD in philosophy. And he also indicated that now with his work over the years and his books have sold millions, that he has been in contact with and interviewed at least 3,000 people who have claimed that they have gone through that near-death experience, just like in the case of Bigfoot, where Mr. Green has over 2,000 individuals. So that does create discussion. It does create interest. Would you do two things for us? First of all, would you describe what you thought of Dr. Moody's speech and that approach? And then secondly, I'm going to have you to share an experience that you had with our audience.
Well, I thought his idea was most interesting because I've had the experience. But what amazed me and gave me pause for thought was his feeling that even though he's interviewed all these people and he has done a lot of research on the near-death experience or this life after death concept, he doesn't buy it. He doesn't really think that it's there, that there is a life after this life.
He indicated that certainly from looking from a scientific viewpoint that those cases are there, but you can't scientifically prove it.
Well, right, because if you're in a near-death experience, you're not recording it or you're not photographing it. You know, you think whatever. But I think that the more you explore things like this, like all of these things, the more skeptical you become. Even though there seems to be a body that believes, but you can believe anything, you know, and you can be persuaded to believe anything. I thought he presented it very well, but he alluded to some experiments that he was doing, and I would like to have heard more about that, because he referred to the movie Flatliners, where medical students create a near-death experience for themselves experimentally, and said he disapproved of that, and yet the feeling I had was that he was doing something similar.
But he made a real strong point with the audience that he thought that was unethical and would not get into that type of research.
Right, but then it makes you wonder what type of research he might be exploring, you know. I felt that there was great response from the audience. There were people sitting near me and people later who were involved with the panel who seemed, they were nodding, you know, they were agreeing with a lot of the things that he said, as though they had been there and perhaps experienced it themselves. Whether people, he talked also about the fact that people see people who have passed away, who have died, and get visions of them. I've had that experience as well, and while I think that it was probably real to me, it was more like a need that I had at the moment, so I created the image. And this is what I think a lot of people might be doing.
The power of the mind is remarkable.
Tremendous. Yes, we have no idea.
Even from the scientific perspective, psychologists and psychiatrists have told us that we use a small percentage of our mental capacity. So you really made me think about something. Are you suggesting that in that time of need that you might tap a larger percentage of one's mental capacity out of the
I believe that,
need?
Definitely.
Do you mind taking us through experience? I know you had physically a thing to happen to you that...
Well, when I was 8, or almost 8, the doctors had given me up. They told my mother that I couldn't last through the night. I couldn't live through the night. I had diphtheria, and in those days there was no cure, and they had done everything they could. And she and a cousin of mine were sitting by the bed, and I could see myself above my body. I could look down at the body. And I saw them sitting there and my mother holding my hand. And it was like, people liken it to a tunnel. To me, it was more like a white hall, a long passageway. And at the end of that passageway was bright light, flowers, children playing, and the most beautiful music I've ever heard before or since. And I wanted to go there. I mean, I was ready to run right down there and go play with those kids. And my mother kept holding my hand and saying, come back, or don't go. I don't remember exactly. And all of a sudden I'm lying on the bed and not really conscious, but I could feel different and I couldn't see it anymore. And in later years when I discussed it with my mother, I said, what happened? And she said, well, I think you died. But she said, I couldn't let go of you. So for whatever reason, and I've questioned it over the years and had another experience later that was similar. But I don't know whether I died or not.
How do you deal with the fact that, like in a week like this, when we're talking about some specific or concrete evidence or scientific evidence, and certainly that has been a theme through the week too, of this issue of verification, and when you can't do that, and Mr. Randy said on this program that there are certain things that certainly are not available for verification, but you have had this experience and it's very real to you.
Sure.
Does that create any kind of frustration on your part that you're not able to? You certainly very clearly tell the story, but beyond that, does that create a frustration? There's some things in life, we can say, well, come with me and I'll show you this house that exists on this corner,
Really
or whatever
was
it
there.
is.
Yeah.
It's very concrete versus abstract.
No, it doesn't create a frustration because I rarely mention it to people that I don't feel are receptive to this kind of thought. We operate on many different levels of thought. There are people who believe things that I wouldn't entertain for a moment, and then I also believe a lot of things that other people wouldn't entertain. So, you just have to be a bit cautious about who you share with.
We'll move to Charlie Glock, and Charlie was on the panel on Friday, and I know you were very intrigued by James Rand. What did he say? Why don't you do a summary of your reaction to his presentation?
Well, he comes to his profession as a magician, so that before he began to investigate psychic phenomena, he was already a well-known, in fact, probably one of the best-known magicians in the world. And his interest in psychic phenomena was sort of stemmed by the knowledge that it was possible to fool people through magic. And once he got interested in this, he's now published 9 books, or the 9th is about to be published, and he's been examining psychic phenomena, channeling, faith healing, etc. In his talk, which I must say was extraordinarily well received, he's a person who speaks with a great deal of humor and great insight, and also he involved the audience in very clever ways. He essentially tried in 1 hour to demonstrate how all of us are subject to believing in psychic phenomena, that all of us have some beliefs that might be called psychic, and we truly believe these. But he also pointed out that since we are subject to this, that many persons with less than good motives make use of this to essentially fool us. And he described, for example, that he had spent 2.5 years studying faith healing in the United States, and in very serious research on this subject had failed in this 2.5 years to find a single evidence of somebody who had been cured by faith. That all of them essentially were people believing that they had been cured, but that in a sense there was no medical evidence to demonstrate it. In his talk, he also used magic to illustrate how it works. One of the ways that ESP has been tested is through a series of cards which people are supposed to guess as you turn them over what kind of symbol is on it. So he involved one of the audience in putting these cards in a special order, and he was blindfolded in effect, and miraculously he was able to predict which cards came up. So in some sense he sort of claimed again that this is subject to manipulation. He also, in his magical illustration used the spoon trick. Have you associated with a Israeli
Uri Geller.
psychic, Uri Geller, and demonstrated that what Geller claimed was a psychic phenomenon, that he had psychic ability to bend a spoon, that Randy could do it right there in front of us. And so we all watched as this spoon was bent and suddenly fell into two pieces. So I think by the time he was over, and this was certainly demonstrated in the panel, he had an audience which was pretty well swimming along with him and agreeing that, and by the time we were all done, we were somewhat sharing his skepticism.
So he did really create a lot more skepticism and urging people to be very research-oriented.
Right.
I'm going to go back to Jeannie Givens, and if we have time, I would like to get all four of you to react to this. We've really absorbed a lot, as we always do. Every year, our subject is something different, and then we share those guests on this TV program. Like last year, it was the First Amendment and the question of censorship, and I always leave the week and this program by thinking, what was the most significant to each individual? What did you come away with that was the most important to you, most astounding? And so I'm going to ask Jeannie Givens to share with us her reaction.
I was most struck by a woman who was on the panel Tuesday dealing with UFOs. She had an experience where she saw a UFO. She had a bus full of kids. She was driving around the school bus, lives in Sandpoint, brought a map and illustrated the UFO, mentioned familiar sighting areas to me, and also backed it up with nearly 100 other people calling law enforcement saying they have seen something in this area. Of course, it was never confirmed, and I was most struck by that incident.
Richard, how about you?
I think the thing that strikes me the most, even though all of the speakers were interesting and I went to hear every last one of them, I think it's last year's First Amendment applied to this year. That we live in a country, we live in a state where we can bring people in that I'll guarantee you had opinions that differed from an awful lot of the rest of us.
That if you're a dissenter or a minority, you can still express yourself.
That's right.
I'm at a rush because of time, but how about you, Joan?
I was impressed with the amount of people who showed interest. I really was, because I was not expecting that many people here.
So that was, the people would come out.
Yes, because when I moved here, there was no interest in anything like that, at least not public.
How about you, Charlie?
Well, I was amazed that I had my 13-year-old grandchild with me, and I figured, well, this is a chore he'll have to sit through because I have him with me. And when it was all over, he was clapping as loud as all the others. Mm-hmm. And in the panel, one of the speakers, the psychologist, got up and said, one of the great things about this is that my 6-year-old was sitting in the audience, and he thought it was great. So this man was able to talk to all of us, and it was sort of impressive. He really had us all captured.
Thank all of you so much for being with us today and ending our long series with these very fascinating comments. Ladies and gentlemen, this ends a 6-week series entitled The Great Mysteries of Our Time. I hope it's been intriguing to you. I hope that out of that, it gives you something to think about, and that's the purpose of this program. Next week, we'll deal with a different issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.